August 18, 1944. A dusty Mercedes staff car speeds down a French country road, heading toward the Metz airfield. In the back seat sits Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, one of the most brilliant military minds of the Third Reich. His gloved hand trembles. He raises a small brass casing to his mouth. He bites down on a small glass capsule. He is dead before his head hits the leather seat. Just days earlier, this man commanded over 500,000 soldiers. He directed the finest SS Panzer divisions the world had ever seen. He had engineered a flawless master plan to split the Allied armies in half and drive them into the sea. Yet, this titan of the German High Command wasn't defeated by a grand Allied trap. He wasn't crushed by George Patton's massive armored columns. He was completely broken by 700 American infantrymen. Trapped on a tiny, battle-scarred piece of dirt called Hill 314, a single, battered American battalion ran out of food. They ran out of ammo. They were completely surrounded by German heavy armor. By all the established rules of war, they should have been wiped out in a matter of hours. But the sheer, unreasonable stubbornness of those farm boys and factory workers didn't just hold a line. It shattered the psychology of a military genius. Today, we are going to look at the exact 6 days that drove Hitler's top commander to madness, and the unbelievable order those Americans gave that sealed his fate. The poison acts fast. It shuts down the central nervous system in a matter of seconds. But in those final, suffocating moments in the back of that Mercedes, von Kluge's mind must have raced back to where it all went wrong, to the arrogance, to the perfect plan that crumbled in the mud. He must have thought back to 12 days earlier, August 6, 1944. To understand the magnitude of what those American boys did, you have to understand the caliber of the man they broke. Günther von Kluge wasn't a political hack. He wasn't a blind, screaming fanatic. His peers in the officer corps called him der Kluge, the clever Kluge. He was a master tactician, a cold, calculating artilleryman who had survived the brutal meat grinder of the Eastern Front by outthinking his Soviet counterparts. He understood logistics, he understood armored warfare, and he understood the grim reality that Germany was slowly collapsing in the hedgerows of Normandy. But von Kluge was also a man operating under a crushing, terrifying weight. Just weeks prior, a bomb had gone off in Hitler's bunker in East Prussia, the infamous July 20th assassination plot. Hitler survived, and his paranoia was absolute. The Führer was purging his generals. Suspicion hung over everyone. Von Kluge knew that his loyalty was being questioned in Berlin. He knew that the only way to keep his head off the executioner's block was to deliver a miracle on the battlefield. Sitting at his heavy oak desk at Army Group B headquarters, von Kluge stared at a teletype message fresh from the Wolf's lair. It was a direct, uncompromising order from Hitler. The Führer was demanding a massive, concentrated armored counterattack. The plan was dubbed Operation Lüttich, and on paper it was a stroke of ruthless, desperate brilliance. Look at the map of France in early August 1944. General George S. Patton's Third Army had finally broken out of the Normandy beachheads. They were tearing south and west, moving faster than any army in history, leaving a trail of dust and destruction. But Patton's supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. All the fuel, all the heavy artillery shells, all the rations keeping Patton's tanks moving had to flow through a narrow, vulnerable bottleneck near the coastal city of Avranches. Hitler saw the flaw. Von Kluge saw the flaw. If the German army could punch through the American lines, drive just 20 miles to the coast, and take Avranches, they would sever the jugular vein of the American military. Patton's entire army would be cut off, stranded. Thousands of American tanks would become useless steel coffins, left to wither and die without a single drop of gas. It was a monumental gamble, but it was the only move left on the chessboard that could turn the tide of the war in the West. And von Kluge was given the absolute best tools remaining in the German arsenal to execute it. He was handed control of 4 premier Panzer divisions. Spearheading the assault were the elite Waffen-SS, specifically the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. These were not green conscripts or terrified teenagers. These were hardened, ruthless veterans who had learned their trade burning villages in the Russian winter. And they were heavily equipped with the pride of German engineering, the Panther tank. The Panther was a 45-ton monster. It featured thick, sloped frontal armor that American Sherman tanks couldn't easily pierce. It mounted a lethal 75mm high-velocity gun that could punch through Allied armor long before the Americans could even get into firing range. In the staging areas under the cover of the dense French forests, the smell of diesel and heavy grease hung thick in the summer air. Hundreds of V-12 Maybach engines idled, waiting for the order to strike. The mechanical roar was deafening. The SS commanders were supremely confident. Intelligence told them the American defensive lines in front of them were weak, spread out, manned by exhausted infantrymen who would break and run for the rear the moment they heard the squeal of German tank treads. For the SS, this wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be a high-speed drive to the beach. Back in his headquarters, von Kluge picked up a red grease pencil. He leaned over the sprawling, meticulously detailed map of the Normandy countryside. He drew a thick, aggressive arrow pointing straight west, directly toward the coastline of Avranches. The arrow sliced cleanly through the American defensive sectors. But right in the center of that red line, right in the direct path of the most terrifying armored force left in Western Europe, was a sleepy, quiet market town, Mortain. And just east of that town, marked by tightly clustered brown topographic lines, sat a rocky, wooded ridge. Elevation, 314 meters. To the German High Command it was nothing, a minor geographic bump, a footnote on a map. Von Kluge figured his leading tank elements would roll over it in less than 2 hours, crushing whatever poor souls happened to be standing in the way. He didn't know that the men sitting on top of that hill had just finished digging their foxholes, and he certainly didn't know that they had absolutely no intention of ever climbing out of them. In the back of the swaying Mercedes, as the lethal dose begins to steal the oxygen from his blood, von Kluge's mind grapples with the one variable his brilliant, flawless calculations failed to account for: human defiance. A military map is a clean, sterile thing. It deals in mathematics. A Panzer division possesses a specific amount of kinetic energy. An infantry battalion possesses a specific threshold for taking casualties. When the threshold is breached, the infantry breaks. They run, or they surrender. That is the logic of war. Von Kluge's dying thought, the thought that would torment him into his final breath, was a simple, maddening realization. The Americans didn't act like soldiers. They didn't know when they were beaten. To understand why the German war machine violently seized up, you have to leave the quiet, immaculate map room of Army Group B and step down into the dirt of Hill 314. The men holding that rocky ridge were the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment. They were part of the 30th Infantry Division, a unit proudly nicknamed Old Hickory after President Andrew Jackson. These were not the highly polished, genetically vetted zealots of the Waffen-SS. They were National Guardsmen, farm boys from North Carolina and Tennessee, mechanics, mill workers, ordinary men who had traded their overalls for olive drab. There were about 700 of them, dug into the hard, unforgiving soil of the hill. On the evening of August 6th, they had just arrived in the Mortain sector. They were exhausted, covered in the fine white dust of the Normandy roads, looking forward to a quiet night and maybe a hot cup of coffee. They didn't know they had just parked themselves squarely on the bullseye of the entire German army. The nightmare began before dawn. A thick, suffocating fog had rolled in off the coast, blanketing the valleys and ridges in a soup so dense you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. But the men of Old Hickory didn't need to see the enemy. They could feel them. The ground beneath their boots began to vibrate. Then came the sound, a heavy, mechanical grinding echoing through the fog. The distinct, terrifying squeal of unlubricated steel tracks, paired with the deep, throaty roar of Maybach V-12 engines. It wasn't just a few tanks. It was a mechanized avalanche. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, was on the move. When the sun finally began to burn away the morning mist, the men on Hill 314 looked down from their foxholes and realized the true horror of their situation. The Germans hadn't just attacked the hill. They had flowed around it like water around a rock. Columns of Panther and Panzer IV tanks, supported by thousands of heavily armed SS infantrymen, had bypassed the ridge entirely, cutting the main roads and capturing the town of Mortain behind them. The 2nd Battalion was completely cut off. There was no road back to the American lines. There were no supply trucks coming up the rear. They were an island in a sea of field grey and Krupp steel. Down in the valley, the SS commanders looked up at the ridge. They knew they couldn't just leave an American battalion sitting on their flank. The hill had to be cleared. They expected it to be easy. A brief, violent artillery barrage, a swift infantry assault, and the terrified Americans would throw down their rifles and raise their hands. The Germans attacked. They were met with a wall of lead. The men of old Hickory didn't run. They laid their heavy M9999 Browning machine guns on the rocks and opened up, tearing through the tree line. Men armed with M1 Garons picked off the German grenadiers as they tried to climb the steep, rocky slopes. For 2 agonizing days, the Germans hurled themselves at the hill, and for 2 days they were thrown back, leaving their dead scattered in the brush. By August 8th, the situation on the hill was growing desperate. The American machine gun barrels were glowing red-hot. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Men were sharing the last drops of water from their canteens. The wounded were lying in slit trenches, bleeding into the dirt without any morphine to dull the pain. Down below, the German commanders were losing their patience. This was completely illogical. The Americans were trapped. They were starving. They were bleeding out. Why wouldn't they just die? An SS officer decided it was time to end the farce. He requested a temporary truce. A German soldier carrying a white flag began the long, slow walk up the road toward the American lines. Beside him walked a sharp, smartly dressed SS officer. They were escorted through the perimeter and brought face to face with the officer commanding the northern defenses of the hill, Lieutenant Ralph Curley. The contrast between the 2 men was staggering. The SS officer stood tall, his uniform crisp, representing the supposed terrifying supremacy of the Third Reich. Lieutenant Curley was covered in mud, his face blackened by gunpowder and sweat, his uniform torn. He looked like a man who had been dragged through hell, but his eyes were cold, and he wasn't trembling. The German officer spoke perfect English. His tone was polite, but dripping with the condescension of a man who believes he holds all the cards. He informed Lieutenant Curley that his battalion was completely surrounded. He pointed out that the Americans were outgunned, cut off from all reinforcement, and facing the combined might of the elite SS Panzer Corps. He offered them a choice. Surrender now, lay down your arms, and your men will be treated humanely as prisoners of war. Refuse, and you will be annihilated to the last man. He demanded an immediate surrender to prevent the useless shedding of blood. Lieutenant Curley didn't consult his superiors. He didn't ask for time to think it over. He looked the SS officer dead in the eye. His answer wasn't a long, grand speech. It wasn't a desperate plea for mercy. It was a promise. Curley said, "I will surrender when every last bullet is fired and our bayonets are sticking in German bellies." The SS officer stared in stunned silence. There was no bluff in the American's voice, just a cold, hard, terrifying truth. The parley was over. The German turned on his heel and walked back down the hill. Lieutenant Curley went back to his foxhole, racked the bolt of his rifle, and waited for the onslaught to begin. When you hear a story like that, an outgunned, exhausted American officer looking a hardened SS commander in the eye and telling him he'd rather use bayonets than raise a white flag, you remember what built this country. It wasn't just industry or resources. It was a specific kind of raw, unapologetic grit. If you still respect the backbone of that greatest generation, please take a second to leave a like on this video. It means a lot to me to see how many of us still honor their memory. Because as that SS officer walked back down into the valley, the German High Command was about to learn a very painful lesson. The men on Hill 314 weren't just refusing to surrender. They were actively dismantling von Kluge's masterpiece, one artillery coordinate at a time. As the poison burns through von Kluge's veins, the grand illusions of the Third Reich melt away into the leather upholstery of the speeding Mercedes. In those final, suffocating moments, he does not think of Hitler's screaming wrath. He thinks of the casualty reports that came across his desk on August 9th and 10th. Dozens of Panther tanks, the pride of German engineering, burning in the French hedgerows. He had sent the most heavily armored, technologically advanced vehicles in the world to crush a lightly armed infantry battalion. It should have been a massacre, but the reports were baffling. The SS Panzer crews weren't being destroyed by American Sherman tanks. They weren't being stopped by hidden anti-tank guns. They were being blown to pieces before they even saw the enemy. To understand the absolute slaughter that unfolded at Mortain, You have to look at the ground. Hill 314 is not just a high point on a map, it is a natural fortress. A jagged spine of rock that commands a sweeping, unobstructed view of the entire valley surrounding the town, all the way to the Sea River. In modern warfare, whoever holds the high ground controls the battlefield. But the men of the 2nd Battalion didn't just have rifles on that ridge. They had eyes. The most dangerous weapon on Hill 314 didn't fire a bullet. It weighed 35 pounds. It was strapped to a man's back like a canvas rucksack, with a long, flexible steel whip antenna reaching up into the tree canopy. The SCR 300 backpack radio. Down in the valley, the commanders of the SS Panzer divisions were growing furious. They would order a column of 45-ton Panther tanks to advance down a sunken dirt road. The German tank commanders would stand tall in their cupolas, supremely confident in their thick, sloped frontal armor. But the moment a German tank rolled out from under the cover of the trees, a pair of binoculars on top of Hill 314 was already locked onto it. Hidden in the rocks and the mud, forward artillery observers, men like 1st Lieutenant Robert Weiss, were whispering coordinates into a black rubber handset. Miles away, safely behind the American lines, the fire direction centers received those numbers. Men in tents feverishly translated the coordinates into deflection and elevation data. They shouted the numbers out to the gun pits. Gun crews scrambled in the dirt. They slammed heavy 95-pound, 155mm shells into the breeches of their massive howitzers. They rammed the powder charges home. Breech blocks slammed shut with a heavy metallic clack. Lanyards were pulled. The German tank crews in the valley never heard the gun that killed them. They only heard the terrifying rushing freight train sound of incoming heavy artillery splitting the sky. The results were devastating. High explosive shells rained down with pinpoint, ruthless accuracy. The thick frontal armor of a Panther tank means absolutely nothing when a 155mm shell detonates directly on the thin steel of its roof. German armored columns were trapped in the narrow French lanes. Lead tanks were blown apart, their turrets thrown into the ditches. Rear tanks were tracked and immobilized. The elite SS infantrymen, caught out in the open without cover, were decimated by shrapnel and white-hot steel. For the Germans, it was like fighting a ghost. Every time they tried to maneuver, every time they tried to shift their forces to push toward the coast and complete von Kluge's grand master plan, the invisible hand of American artillery smacked them down into the dirt. Von Kluge's flawless, high-speed offensive had ground to a violent, bloody halt. A mechanized army cannot move if it cannot hide from the eyes on the hill. The German commanders finally realized the grim reality of their situation. The American infantrymen on the ridge weren't just defending a perimeter. They were acting as the conductor for a symphony of mass destruction. If the Germans wanted to take Avranches, if they wanted to win the war in France, they had to blind the Americans. They had to silence the radio on Hill 314. The SS turned their full, terrifying fury toward the ridge. They stopped trying to bypass the hill and started throwing everything they had directly at it. Mortars rained down continuously. Flak guns were leveled horizontally to chew through the trees. Snipers crawled through the brush, hunting for anyone wearing a radio harness. But the Americans didn't need to be shot off the hill. Time was doing the job for the Germans. By the end of the 3rd day, the men of the 2nd Battalion were starving. The wounded were dying in their foxholes from infection and shock. But most critically, the heavy dry cell batteries in the SCR 300 radio were dying. The voice of the artillery observer was fading to a weak, static-filled crackle. Without that radio, the men on Hill 314 were just 700 exhausted guys with rifles waiting to be run over by heavy armor. The American lines were miles away. No supply truck could get through the wall of German panzers surrounding the base of the hill. No cargo plane could drop supplies through the dense, low-hanging fog and the ferocious wall of German anti-aircraft fire. The situation was mathematically impossible. The men on the hill were going to go deaf, blind, and then they were going to be annihilated. But the American military doesn't run on math. It runs on the stubborn, desperate ingenuity of the men on the ground. And the men in the artillery batteries miles away were about to pull off a mechanical miracle that the German high command could never have predicted. By the 4th day of the siege, the situation on Hill 314 had crossed the line from desperate to fatal. The heavy dry cell batteries powering the American SCR-300 radio were dying. The clear, sharp voice of the forward observer, calling down hell on the German Panzer columns, had faded to a weak, static-laced whisper. Down in the valley, the SS commanders could sense it. The terrifying rain of American artillery was slowing down. The coordination was slipping. The Germans knew that if that radio died, the eyes of the American army were permanently gouged out. And the moment that happened, the Panther tanks would roll right over the ridge. Behind the American lines, the commanders of the 30th Infantry Division knew it, too. They had tried everything to break through to the trapped men. Armored pushes were repelled by thick screens of German anti-tank guns. They tried the air. Flight after flight of C-47 transport planes, completely unarmored and flying low and slow, braved a solid wall of German flak to drop supply canisters. But the drop zone was too small. The wind pushed the parachutes into the trees, or worse, right into the German lines. The men of the 2nd Battalion were watching their own food and ammunition fall into the hands of the enemy trying to kill them. Standard military logistics had failed. If those men were going to survive, the solution wasn't going to come from a textbook. It was going to come from the knuckle-busting, grease-stained ingenuity of the American artillerymen. Miles away, the gun crews of the 105mm howitzer batteries looked at the massive stacks of ammunition piled in the dirt. They couldn't drive a truck to the hill. They couldn't fly a plane to the hill. But they could shoot a heavy piece of steel with pinpoint accuracy exactly where it needed to go. They decided to deliver the mail by cannon. What happened next is a masterpiece of field-expedient engineering. The artillerymen took standard 105mm smoke and illumination shells. Working frantically, they unscrewed the fuses. They meticulously gutted the heavy steel casings, pulling out the base ejection charges and the chemical payloads. They were left with a heavy, hollow steel tube. Into these empty casings, they began to stuff the absolute bare essentials of life and death. They packed tightly wrapped bundles of bandages, morphine syringes to stop the agonizing pain of the wounded lying in the dirt, vials of blood plasma, and most importantly, the heavy BA-38 dry cell batteries needed to power the SCR-300 radio. But there was a massive physical problem. When you fire a 105mm howitzer, the shell undergoes thousands of Gs of sheer kinetic force as it violently accelerates out of the barrel. When it lands, it slams into the earth with the speed of a freight train. If you just dropped a fragile radio battery and glass vials of plasma into a steel tube and fired it, the contents would be pulverized into useless powder before the shell even cleared the muzzle. The artillerymen had to absorb the shock. They packed the empty spaces inside the shells with sawdust. They stuffed in handfuls of dirt, rags, and pieces of parachute silk. They wrapped the batteries tightly, wedging them into the steel casings, so they couldn't shift a single millimeter. They screwed the caps back on. They loaded the heavy steel packages into the breeches of the guns. They pulled the lanyards. The guns roared, sending the gutted shells arcing high over the French countryside, soaring right over the heads of the baffled German Panzer divisions. On top of Hill 314, the American infantrymen heard the familiar, terrifying whistle of incoming artillery. They braced for the explosions, but there was no deafening crack, no spray of lethal shrapnel, just a heavy, violent thud as the steel casings buried themselves deep into the rocky soil. Under the withering fire of German machine guns, the farm boys and factory workers crawled out of their foxholes. They scrambled through the dirt on their bellies, digging frantically with their bare hands and entrenching tools to unearth the steel tubes. They dragged the heavy shells back to the deep trenches. They unscrewed the caps. They dug through the packed sawdust and dirt, and they pulled out the batteries, intact. Within minutes, the old batteries were ripped out of the backpack radio. The new ones were slotted in. The heavy steel latches were snapped shut. The headset cracked loudly to life. The voice of the American observer came through the radio network, loud, clear, and perfectly dialed in. And the rain of high explosive steel immediately resumed falling on the German armor in the valley. War looks like a simple math problem on a general's map. Tanks beat infantry, numbers beat courage. But history is always written by the sheer, irrational willpower of the men bleeding in the mud. Down in the valley, the German commanders watched in absolute horror as their tanks began exploding again. They had surrounded the hill. They had starved the Americans. They had cut off every conceivable route of supply. And yet, the artillery continued to fall with brutal mechanical precision. In his headquarters miles away, Field Marshal von Kluge was running out of time. The clock was ticking. The skies were beginning to clear. And with clear skies came the Allied fighter bombers. If he didn't break the American lines and take Avranches immediately, his entire panzer force would be caught out in the open and wiped out from the air. He couldn't bypass the hill. He couldn't starve them out. There was only one brutal, primitive option left. He ordered his elite SS divisions to stop trying to maneuver. He ordered them to take the hill by sheer, overwhelming brute force. No more tactics. No more truces. They were going to charge straight up the slopes of Hill 314, step over their own dead, and drag the Americans out of their foxholes with their bare hands. The climax of the Battle of Mortain had arrived, and the men of the 2nd Battalion were about to make a decision that would cement their legacy in the blood-soaked soil of France forever. August 11th, 1944. The final assault began not with a creeping barrage, but with a desperate, screaming fury. The commanders of the SS Panzer divisions knew their time was up. The skies over Normandy were clearing. The Allied fighter bombers were already warming up their engines on the tarmac. If the Germans did not take Hill 314 right then, they were going to be wiped off the map. The SS infantrymen surged up the rocky slopes. They didn't bother with cover. They charged straight into the American machine gun fire, stepping over the crumpled bodies of their own men. The sheer weight of the German numbers finally began to crack the American perimeter. Foxholes were overrun. The fighting devolved into a brutal, intimate nightmare. Rifles were fired at point-blank range. Men swung entrenching tools and drove bayonets into field-grey tunics, just as Lieutenant Curley had promised. But there were simply too many of them. The SS were swarming the ridge. The American line was disintegrating. Deep in his foxhole, the American forward artillery observer gripped the heavy rubber handset of the SCR 300 radio. He watched the grey uniforms pouring over the rocks just yards away. He knew that in a matter of seconds, they would be on top of him. He keyed the microphone one last time. He didn't ask for reinforcements. He didn't ask for an extraction. He calmly read out a string of coordinates. Miles away, inside the American Fire Direction Center, the radio operator scribbled the numbers down on a notepad. Then, the operator froze. He looked at his map. He looked back at the numbers. He keyed his microphone and frantically told the observer on the hill to recheck his data. Those coordinates were wrong. That was the exact location of the American perimeter. Through the static, over the terrifying crackle of close-quarters gunfire, the voice from Hill 310 came back cold and absolute. The coordinates are correct. Bring it down on us. 7 days later, inside the back of a speeding Mercedes, the toxin rips through Field Marshal Günther von Kluge's nervous system. His breathing stops. His chest goes still. He chose to die on this quiet French road because he knew what was waiting for him in Berlin. Hitler was raging. The Führer blamed von Kluge for the total collapse of the German army in the West. He suspected him of treason. He had ordered him back to face the hangman's noose. But von Kluge knew the truth. His grand, flawless offensive didn't fail because of treason. It failed because of what happened next on that hill. Miles behind the American lines, the heavy 155mm howitzers elevated their massive barrels. The lanyards were pulled. The sky above Hill 314 was instantly torn apart by a shrieking metallic roar. Hundreds of high-explosive shells slammed directly into the summit of the ridge. The earth simply exploded. The American infantrymen threw themselves into the absolute bottom of their foxholes. They pressed their faces into the dirt, covered their heads, and prayed as the ground heaved and shattered around them. The German SS infantrymen, caught completely out in the open, exposed on the rocks, were instantly obliterated. The artillery rained down with terrifying, indiscriminate violence. It chewed through the trees. It shattered the granite. It pulverized the German assault waves before they could even scream. When the barrage finally lifted, a thick, choking cloud of cordite and dust hung over the hill. The woods were on fire. The ground was cratered like the surface of the moon. Slowly, covered in ash and dirt, the men of old Hickory climbed out of the rubble. Their ears were bleeding. Their uniforms were shredded. But the grey uniforms were gone. The German assault was completely broken. The SS survivors were fleeing back down into the valley in absolute terror. The next day, August 12th, the first American relief tanks finally broke through the German lines and rolled up to the base of Hill 314. The sight that greeted them was something out of a horror film. The slopes were carpeted with destroyed German armor and the bodies of elite SS troops. Of the roughly 700 American men who had dug in on that ridge 6 days earlier, over 300 were dead or severely wounded. But they hadn't given up a single inch of ground. By holding that useless, rocky hill, the men of the 2nd Battalion had permanently derailed Hitler's last great offensive in France. Because von Kluge's panzers were stalled at Mortain, the Allied armies had time to completely encircle the German forces, trapping them in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. Over 50,000 German soldiers would be captured, 10,000 would be killed. The German army in the west was effectively destroyed, all because a group of farm boys, mechanics and clerks simply refused to run. Many of you watching right now have fathers, uncles or grandfathers who wore the uniform in World War II. They were the men who came home, went back to work, and rarely talked about the horrors they saw. But sometimes, when the house was quiet, or sitting around the dinner table, they brought out the stories that never made it into the official history books. The quiet stories of sacrifice. The stories of ordinary men doing impossible things. Please go down into the comments below, share their names, share the units they served in. Share those stories you heard on the porch. Do not let their memories fade away with time. We owe them that much. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.